Good morning, everyone. My name is Cary, and I am a researcher from the University of Rome, Sapienza in Italy. I'm here to talk about a project that Robert actually mentioned, which was great in his earlier talk, that I think shows a lot of how the connection between our two different discussions today, what it's based around. And I think part of it is this. Oh, thanks. Sorry. I can stay here, actually. Maybe it's easier. I tend to walk around a bit. So I think that the connection between research, activism, and policy, as we know, there's quite a big disconnect. And so groups like EcoLease do a great job of really establishing networks embedded within networks to try to sort of bridge this debate. I'm going to talk about this project called TESS, which stands for Towards a European Sustainable Society. It was a project funded by the EU, which ran from 2013 to 2016, and which I was fortunate enough to be a part of. So, as we all know, across Europe, grassroots community-led initiatives have emerged to deal with the big challenges of the early 21st century, especially at the local level. The TESS project researched these CBIs, or community-based initiatives, and we examined their success and growth to determine how policy could help encourage the further development of grassroots action across the EU. So my talk today is going to briefly introduce what the TESS project was about and how some of our findings respond to the following questions. First, I'll introduce the concept of resilience and how it's relative or relevant within a community-based initiative perspective. I'll explain what we found about the potential impact of CBIs with respect to their economic effects and their carbon reduction potential. We'll look at some of the various institutional structures that support these initiatives. And finally, I'll introduce two of the main practical outputs from our research program, the Resilience Compass and the Track It tool. And we'll conclude with some final messages about what these projects that we researched in TESS can help tell us about the role of community initiatives in sustainability transitions. So the overall goal of this project was to provide an understanding of the outscaling possibilities of community-based initiatives with high innovation potential towards sustainability. In order to do so, we looked at answering two major questions. First, what's the impact of CBIs, both in terms of carbon reduction and economic effects? And secondly, what are the institutional structures that support them in helping to spread their desired impacts? To answer these two questions, the TESS project integrated both natural and social sciences, and we collected qualitative and quantitative data through interviews and surveys with 63 community-based initiatives from the city of Rome, part of the city region of Berlin, the region of Catalonia in Spain, and the countries of Finland, Romania, and Scotland. The TESS initiatives worked over a wide range of sectors. They produced or distributed organic food, they recovered food waste, they were recycling and reusing materials, they promoted sustainable transportation, and some generated and distributed renewable energy. Overall, our findings indicated that success means a very different thing to every single group. So, in the next slides, I'll try and describe and link some of the examples of the findings of this research project to show how the community groups we studied, they included multiple objectives and activities, how they were able to contribute or create impact through working with others, and how they could be used to inspire similar models to be replicated in other places. So let's start with the concept of resilience. Resilient communities are more likely to persist and adapt to a changing world. They're more likely to develop positive responses to local manifestations of wider societal unsustainability. And because communities are such complex systems, resilience can't be precisely measured. However, inspired by recent work by Nick Wilding, who suggests a basic framework for evaluating community resilience, we built on this to develop our online tools and applied it as a conceptual framework in our research. And in the following slides, I'm going to describe some of the key elements of this framework very briefly, and then we can talk a little bit about how they could be applied in your own community initiatives using some of the tools that we created. So we consider 4 dimensions that contribute to making a community resilient. First, these 4 aspects we envisioned as sort of a compass of a community. We have people, we have economy, we have links, and culture. In terms of healthy and engaged people, we think that this relates to the physical, the psychological well-being of individuals in any community. And of course, it's connected to the quality and the strengths of their interpersonal relationships, their connection to nature, their opportunities and willingness to learn and develop new skills, and so on. More localized economies within ecological limits is another aspect of a resilient community. We related this to the creation of a different sort of local economy. This means it's an economy that positively stewards the local environment and resources, it cuts carbon dependency, and it helps establish meaningful, locally based livelihoods that are less dependent on fossil fuels. Building a creative and inclusive culture relates to how a community addresses issues of social inclusion, social justice, and equity, and how open they are to creating and exploring different or new ways of working. Finally, we have cross-community links. These relate to the strength of the connections and links and partnerships to both other communities and across sectors. This includes the public sector or the government as well as business. And so the further out you move on this compass, the stronger, let's say, the resilience of the community is. The second component deals with different distinct states of resilience. So we identified, building on Nick Wilding's framework, 3 different states. The first of which is a breakdown state, when a community is fragile and it's at risk of collapse without outside help. This is sort of the core of the compass. The second stage, as you move outwards, is a break even, which is the ability to cope with disruptions, to absorb shocks, to bounce back, to something sort of approximating a more normal, stable state. Finally, you have a breakthrough state in which you're able to thrive or change and to use the outside shocks, not only as a stimulus, but as a way of creating a better future. And although they can be easily tabulated with some examples, we developed these into an online tool, which is the Resilience Compass. The TESS Resilience Compass is online, and we developed it to encourage initiatives to assess and reflect on the resilience of their own community. For instance, are they prone to breakdown? Are they capable of transforming challenges into positive change? By answering a series of questions and scaling them, you're able to better understand as an engagement tool within your community how fragile, which state of resilience your community is. And if you go to our website, sustainablecommunities.eu, you'll also find some tools, including a video tutorial and some support materials for using this within your own exploring community resilience workshops for your own organizations. In terms of economic impact, we found that these community-based initiatives are key drivers of local innovation. In fact, 3/4 of all of the initiatives we surveyed had pioneered a service, a product, or a process which was new within the local context and that provided opportunities to local communities to help improve the quality and/or quality of accessible goods and services. Even though our initiatives were reluctant to calculate the marketable contribution, or let's say the economic value of their activities, they did prefer to use a non-market or share-based model of consumption. They had the capacity to deliver tangible economic benefits to participants, either through direct and indirect job creation, sustaining local economic revitalization, or through wealth retention. In terms of economic functioning, they also used a variety of income generation approaches, but access to public funding was generally difficult. A good example of this is an initiative in Germany that aimed to help reduce food waste, and they use an innovative approach that generates real economic and environmental impacts. So this organization picks up food from local supermarkets and bakeries, and it accepts donations from private citizens of food which would otherwise be thrown out. When it first began, there was a small group of volunteers that managed the work via Excel sheets, which of course was very timely and required a lot of effort. Since then, an internet platform has developed, making their work much easier, and it's enabled the initiative to spread to other cities as well as countries. Today, around 11,000 members self-organize their daily tasks through the online platform. It not only connects the members with more than 2,000 partners, but it also organizes food pickups and lets members know when food's available so that they can access and use it. The internet platform has allowed this group to expand from a highly localized initiative in Berlin to other cities in Germany, as well as Austria and Switzerland. Another issue that we tackled in TESS dealt with the fact that many existing community-based initiatives are already delivering key services in the food, energy, transport, and waste sectors, and they're simultaneously reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, there was a lack, or there still is, let's say, a lack of a systematic and quantitative assessment methodology to estimate the climate change mitigation potential of their activities. The Track It tool was developed using, using a methodology where the results are based on the total greenhouse gas reductions compared to a specific baseline scenario. And the total reductions are expressed as a fraction of each beneficiary or participant's per capita carbon footprint. So for example, using our tool, we estimated that electricity provided from the renewable energy sources run by our community-based initiatives have the potential to reduce the carbon footprint of their participants or beneficiaries of around 11%. For the food domain, the test results suggest that what you eat is much more important than how it's produced. By consuming vegan or vegetarian meals, beneficiaries of the analyzed CBIs were able to reduce their GHG footprints by around 7%. Also, the redistribution of still edible food from supermarkets has a large relevance for climate mitigation. Sorry, this is still going. Again, this tool is also available on our website, sustainable-communities.eu. So although the GHG reductions achieved by the selected CBIs varied considerably across different activities, overall the results demonstrate the large potential for climate change mitigation from these types of CBIs. As Robert mentioned earlier, if 5% of all EU citizens were able to engage in a CBI with activities similar to those analyzed, we would be able to get 85% of the EU 28 countries to help meet their 2020 emissions reduction targets. I'm actually going to skip through this case study just for a lack of time, and I'll instead talk about an example of a high carbon potential reduction initiative from the Spanish energy sector. The Spanish energy sector is highly centralized and it's controlled by a few large corporations. Som Energia is a renewable energy consumers co-op that's challenging the structure. Initially, it was a very localized initiative that brought people together that wanted to purchase renewable electricity, but it's since become very widely known in Spain and established and expanded throughout the country. The growth of this initiative was facilitated by the efficient cooperation of a team of 20 professionals that manage the energy production and commercialization. They're supported by local volunteer groups who promote the activities and work on establishing relations with local authorities. All of the debates and strategic decisions are exchanged in what they call the plataforma, which is an online forum where the local groups and the individual members interact. And this model allows citizens to replicate the cooperative in their own autonomous regions through the creation of new local groups. As of 2019, what started with around 20 people had grown to activities in 63 locations in Spain. They currently have 54,000 members, and they service nearly 60,000 clients. But as well as fostering technological and social innovation, this co-op is an example of how we're changing the way that people think. By providing a model of how energy can be distributed differently, Som Energia challenges the entrenched systems and encourages a wider culture of innovation that's necessary for the transitions to a more sustainable future. In terms of the policy environment or the institutional framework in which most of our CBIs exist, we can say that on average, the dialogue between CBIs and public agencies is scarce. But there's a great variation across regions. So for instance, in Scotland and Germany and Finland, CBIs tended to have a very strong or closer ties to the local authorities, whereas public institutions in Spain and Italy were less common. Moreover, the different organizations' members had quite mixed opinions about collaborating with public institutions as well. Some felt that their role as a CBI was to fill an institutional gap or to supplement public institutions, whereas others were completely opposed and abstained from any type of interaction. And then a third group we categorize as well that do a little bit of both. They had sort of mixed feelings about both. Overall, public funding was important for the emergence and the performance of CBIs, but it wasn't as important as the wider policy environment in which these initiatives were situated. So, the policy environments that were characterized by transparency, accountability, simplified procedures and bureaucracy were unsurprisingly found to benefit the emergence and performance of CBIs. But even more important was the fact that these groups sought to ensure the interest, the understanding, and the openness on the side of the policymakers and public institutions for different and diverse types of socioeconomic organizations to exist. An example of this is Eno Energy, which is a co-op and community-based enterprise in eastern Finland, which was founded in 1999. This co-op is owned by local forest owners, and it aims to produce inexpensive district heat from the local community with locally sourced energy from wood, a part of which comes from its members. The co-op was founded as a joint effort by different actors with different aims. The municipality, on the one hand, wanted to change their heat production from oil to wood-based and advance rural livelihoods. At the same time, the local forestry center had development projects related to advancing forest energy and related developments in the region. From this starting point, the local forest owners stepped up and they founded the co-op. The municipality assigned the initial investment in the heat plant and district heat distribution network, but the co-op later purchased these facilities and expanded its activities. Currently, the co-op owns and operates 3 heat plants and the district heat distribution network in the local community. It is active in broad collaboration at the local, the regional, the national, and international level, and it's even commercialized tours of its heat production facilities and field trips on energy wood production. The co-op is a great example of how different actors with diverse interests and aims can team up and change things towards a more sustainable local energy production, and they share a vision for an oil-free region in the future. I just have a few more minutes left, so I will briefly talk about some of the success factors that we know, or that we found through our research. So one example, I think, comes from where I'm currently living, from Rome. So in the early 1990s, urban development and gentrification was threatening a green space in a peripheral neighborhood of the city, and the local residents came together to oppose it. This confrontational act paradoxically laid the groundwork for 2 decades of positive social and environmental activism and education. The Casale Poderi Rosa is a refurbished ancient farmhouse that brings together an organic restaurant, a solidarity purchasing group, an environmental library, and urban gardening. Together with the association, meetings, workshops, and events in this constellation have created one of the most comprehensive environmental organizations in the region. The thread that runs through 2 decades of the initiative's members' work was the desire to raise awareness about the value of the local economy and its natural resources. What started with very simple educational activities by setting up the first ecological library in the city eventually evolved to engaging local producers in a community-supported agriculture scheme. It developed an organic restaurant, and a few years ago, they expanded into urban gardening using 100 plots of abandoned land close to the library. Since workers' rights are the second focus of this initiative, they've made a point of hiring and providing small salaries to former volunteers that worked for the initiative. Over time, this ecological culture has permeated the neighborhood, and it's inspired the creation of similar initiatives in close proximity. I will skip this one to wrap up towards the conclusions. So, in order to replace the current carbon-based economies and help avert dangerous climate change, this transition to a low-carbon or a carbon-neutral society is urgently needed. We all know this. But this shift is going to have to take place at multiple scales. It can be driven by governments, businesses, but most of all by communities. The potential of communities to take a lead in creating the fertile ground for this transformational change has been illustrated by the extraordinary range of creativity and innovation being carried out by the initiatives that we studied in the TESS project. Too often, however, our findings showed that these community initiatives are frustrated by bureaucratic obstacles, by unsupportive or misaligned policies or subsidies, or by a lack of appropriate physical infrastructure. The TESS project developed methodologies and tools for monitoring and reporting the social, political, economic, technological, and environmental impacts of these community-based initiatives, as well as their carbon emission savings. And these methods were designed to produce comparable results across Europe. In sum, the CBI's impacts can be classified as both tangible, which can be measured quantitatively or qualitatively, and intangible, which are harder to evaluate using conventional methods. But in order to find or to understand a full comprehension of the role of these groups in inciting and sustaining a low-carbon transition, we have to consider both tangible and intangible impacts. For instance, the CBIs that were engaged in providing sustainable energy showed the highest performance regarding carbon reductions. But community gardens are equally important, even though they emphasize more the enhancement of social capital and inclusion. Tangible impacts are often considered the first and only measure of success for CBIs. These include direct environmental or economic impacts like greenhouse gas emission reductions or the generation of sustainable jobs. But at least as significant as the carbon savings that many of these initiatives achieve are the wider environmental impacts, the awareness raising, the social cohesion, the creation of local livelihoods and retention of wealth in local economies. And most of all, the feelings of empowerment that can come through working together to bring about change. In order to realize the transition potential of communities, regulations, our evaluation techniques, and above all, our mindsets are going to have to change. TESS represented one effort to contribute to this in exploring the role of community-based initiatives in transitioning towards a sustainable and low-carbon or carbon-neutral Europe. Thank you again to the organizers for inviting me here to speak to you today, and thank you to all in the audience for your attention.
Thank you, Cary, for lots of information and examples. Either right away, any question or comment or sharing of your own experience related to the topic that Cary has shared? Yeah.
I just have a short comment, even though I'm here on official duty on behalf of our language co-op. I'm very happy to be here. Both lectures were very inspiring also to me personally. And in this way, I'm going to be able to bring something back to my co-workers and my friends to try and do something not only in the field of social responsibility, what we're doing, but also in this environmental field. So thank you to both speakers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name is Rok. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a reflection on one of the issues that when when we talk about transformation discourses that are rooted in this notion of local resilience, sometimes this risks that the shifts, the burdens are shifted to individuals and communities as the most appropriate drivers of transformational change rather than systemic drivers of global change, i.e. the state, capitalist production systems, transnational corporations, etc. So I really welcome the second presentation as complementary to the first, where we went more into the policy and institutional change side. But I still felt a bit of a shortcoming on that side specifically, not just what kind of policies are or not present or bureaucratic barriers or not, but how to actually change policy processes towards more deliberative forms and actually integrate science and citizen science with a civil society and policy making. Thank you.
Is this a question? Would you like Cary or anyone to comment on that? Or was that just your sharing?
Well, maybe like on the experiences of these cases, maybe if there are some instances where you see possibilities for some synergies with, say, local authorities or even state authorities. For example, like this time last year we spoke with Michel Bauenskier about his ideas of commons transition. There's also some examples in Italy, like the Co-Bologna process, which I think gives really nice precedence for this type of thing. So I was just wondering if yeah.
Thanks for the comment. So I think it's really relevant because from what we saw in the TESS case studies, in terms of interaction with and in dialogue with policymakers at the local level, we saw sort of two if not three different roles. So one is, for instance, the case, the Finnish energy co-op that I presented, where you have sort of an alignment of shared interests that allows this type of collaborative effort to really take off. So it was a timing question and good fortune that, you know, at the same time that this local wood producers association was looking to expand their activities, at the same time at the municipal level, they expressed an interest in shifting from oil to bioenergy-based heating supplies. So in that case, it's more of the policy, let's say, already existing and being able to take advantage of what's occurring locally. We had another case, or we have multiple other cases of initiatives that are completely, let's say, disengaged with not just local policy, but government in general. In Catalonia, we had a very interesting case of, some call it an eco-village, some call it like a degrowth movement, but it's essentially a community that lives outside of the city of Barcelona, which is more than just disengaged from local authorities. They're quite oppositional to local authorities, and I think that's part of your earlier comment about the wider societal, let's say, or capitalist-driven, or however you want to frame the problematique of what's driving what's happening. And in this case, they present an alternative that essentially rejects the notion of business as usual and engaging with, let's say, micro-level changes. And I think that the role of the CBIs or these community-based initiatives, it depends very much on both the scale of the initiative themselves, as well as the diversity of activities that they have. So for instance, in Scotland, we had these big land development trusts that were basically community-led, but they're operating at a very different scale because they're trying to build wind farms, they're trying to engage in a number of activities that include tourism, education, agricultural production. So they have a sort of different concept that relies on local policymakers. It really needs that buy-in from a regulatory and funding perspective. And then going back to the Catalonian example as well of the degrowth eco-village, they have a different model in mind, and they started as a very small group with a very strong strong idea. And so what we saw is as these groups diversify, which I think is something Robert talked about in focusing on outscaling and not upscaling. I think that something that we experienced in working with these organizations was that a lot of them have this target of increasing their membership, of really engaging as many as they can, but it was actually the failure of a couple of the initiatives that we worked with that no longer exist. You grow very fast, you have a lot of good ideas, you have a lot of enthusiasm, but you also have to find a delicate balance between ideological views, engagement with other institutions, with other actors. It becomes more complicated. So I think that there is a very unexplored channel for engaging policy with research, with activism a lot more strongly, but unfortunately I don't have any advice or recommendations necessarily about how they can happen. It's very contextual, you know. So thanks for the comment.
Yeah, connected to that was actually also my main question, which was knowing that in Slovenia we have a lot of municipalities and a lot of mayors who have a lot of power. So what are some success factors from your research and experience in kind of bridging, or let's say bringing together, let's say both the local authorities, you know, in Slovenia this means kind of smallish local communities very often, can be only a couple of thousand people, with community-based initiatives. So how can, you know, they come to a synergy? What are some success factors that did make a difference for them starting to work together or not?
Thanks for the question. I think it's, so from the research perspective, and I will sort of be a little bit academic in this way, but from the research perspective, really it's all about the local context. I mean, we had such varied, you know, from very conflictual relations between the local government and the organizations to very embedded and synergetic relationships with local government. And so this diversity in a place like Slovenia, which you said is characterized by these smaller municipalities, I think it's the first step that came out of the research is to really understand what the existing networks are. Really to try to not be as prescriptive, and I have a hard time saying that because this was a project that essentially was supposed to give, you know, an input to sort of prescriptive policy making from the EU level, but it is very localized, it is very contextual, and I think the first understanding, or the first step towards understanding that is sort of mapping out what the varied interests are. The success stories, let's say, that we saw longer term were where almost permanent dialogues had been established over the years. Maybe not necessarily about, for instance, promoting cycling in Romania, but by using, and it's something that Robert said as well, I think, this sort of embedded networks perspective, that even though the initial target of certain networks, you know, might not be activity-wise the same as others, really building on those similar or shared interests and establishing ties between groups that have similar aims, those were strong aspects that we saw in the more longer-term successful communities. I don't know across the board, because unfortunately I don't know enough about the Slovenian political landscape, but you know, we had much more centralized authorities, for instance, in the Scottish case studies, as opposed to Rome, which by number of laws, for instance, was much more, let's say, much heavier from a regulatory perspective. But, you know, paradoxically, you actually had more freedom at the local level in Rome than you did in Scotland. So there's a lot of different factors that I think are highly localized, and really understanding that, or playing to the strengths of those factors, help to establish the right networks and the right relationships that were necessary.